Okay, so this will be kind of a condensed version of what I imagine later on will be a longer series of tutorials introducing students to the use of RenderMan and also the basics of three-point lighting in CGI. So I'm using a character designed, modeled, rigged by one of my grad students, Ellie Nico. And I wanted to create a few tutorials for her to get her introduced to RenderMan as well as a couple of my other students. We've used Mental Ray for a long time in our computer lab, but we're now moving over to RenderMan. So we'll cover that. So, but just before I get started, I want to basically start at the end, right? So I've already set up my scene. I've got some RenderMan lights in here, and I've done 3 different renders. Or 4 different renders, and in each one of these I've turned the lights, one light on and off. So if you're curious, go ahead and just do a Google search for 3-point lighting. You will see hundreds of pages. It's kind of a standard default used when doing portraiture or lighting for, say, a news report or an interview or something like that. The basic idea is that you would have a key light to light the scene. Okay, so this is this render here, right? So this pose is not going to change in between. So it's just a main light on the subject. Usually it kind of up above at what people would call a 45 and a 45. This one actually is more of a direct approach, straight down. And then the second light that you might have is a rim light, or a light basically from the back. It helps separate the object or the model, sculpture, character, whatever it might be that you're photographing, whether that's real photography or synthetic photography. Will separate that from the background, right? So I have another light. You can kind of see it here in the editor view. It has the little barn doors and it's a square area light. So I can place that in here, and this is doing a nice job of highlighting the character in these little areas. And then the third light that you might see in this scenario is a fill light. I think in this scenario I'm doing something almost key light, fill light. I think you could argue like which one of these between this and this is your key and fill light. But I set up this main one to light everything here. I have that rim light, that backlight, and then I have a large area light off to the side, and I made it the shape of it, and we'll go into the preview here in a second and look at what the setup looks like. And I also changed the color of it, so I'm getting kind of a warm cast to it. Almost treated this as not so much just a light itself, but maybe it was, it's like a large panel of light coming from another room. It's more environmental, I guess, than focused. Right? So the idea with the fill light is to fill in all the dark areas. So you can see here a lot of darks down here on these shadows, and we want to get a little more detail down into that area. So you can see I have this fill light is doing that for me. Right? And then the third, it's just kind of a background light. So I think when you're doing a setup here, I have a ramp that I just built, right? So it's just a floor that transitions into like a photo backdrop. So this last render here is the light itself is just lighting the background, okay? And I could do this maybe in post and create my own separate background, but there's something about now that we're using path tracing rendering and bouncing light around the scene, it's a good idea to introduce that light into the scene itself. It definitely influences things. So let's see if I do this here, you can see, I press the space bar there. You can see all the lighting. To see if there's a way to actually slow that down. That would be kind of a cool transition. There we go. Sorry about that. All right, so this is the last render. 6 minutes and 31 seconds, not bad. Based on the render settings. So in this tutorial, I'm not going to get too deep down into the RenderMan render settings, but I will cover some of that. So, all right. So this is part 1. I'll just save this. I want you to see. I guess the last thing is with this still over here. Let's look at our scene And then part 2, we're going to reconstruct this together. All right, so in our perspective view, you can see we have the model kind of posed. And the other thing too is, as I was posing the model, I had a good idea where I wanted to set the camera up. So it's not an accident that our character seems to be looking straight at us, straight at where the camera is. So in a still scene like this, or an animated scene, it's obviously very important to think about where that camera is going to be at the very beginning, so that you can situate your lights accordingly, right? If my camera's going to be here, that has bearing on me putting this light here in the background, right? So this is just an area light. You can just tweak it if I want a little bit. A little RenderMan icon on there. And I've added barn doors to that one because I didn't want this light to influence the background. That's what this one is for. And I tried to use a variety of shapes to do this. And I also have an area light here. That's what I'm calling my key light. And you can see this one off to the side. This larger one I'm using as a fill. And again, in a traditional sense, it's debatable which one of these is the key and the fill light. And a 3-light setup is just a jumping off point, right? I think it's a great place to figure out what it is that you want to do, but that also can get a little stale as you think about you approaching every lighting scenario that way. So I think it's good to learn the basics of this and get comfortable with it, and then think about how do you want to break the rules. The one thing I'd say is that, and that I see a lot of students do, is they're just used to turning on physical sun and sky. That's fine. It's a quick way to get some lighting, but it gets a little boring and it doesn't have any atmosphere. And the other thing about it is you're not really sculpting with light. That's the way I think about lighting setups that are more theatrical and focused, is that you're really sculpting. And I think that comes across here, right? Where we're starting to show structure. We're using this one to accentuate the rest of the form. It's also creating a silhouette, so it pulls away from the background. We're giving hints of other environmental effects and adding color to the scene with both of those two. You can see I used a blue one here and a warm light. And then this third one here, thinking about background. And maybe I should put some barn doors on this. Maybe I should just focus it so that it's not lighting all the background, but maybe it's something more focused towards the head. Every time I start rendering, there's all these little tweaks. I did examples before. You'll notice here in this setup how defined the lips are on that face. And when I did a previous render with the fill, the lighting rig, or the area light for that, pull that back up. The area light was actually further down and pointed up, and it kind of washed out that little detail. And to tell you the truth, I'm not totally excited about it, right? I still think would rather see a little more of that separation between this lip and the lighting. Maybe that will happen with the materials, but I made a quick change based on doing this tutorial, and it's definitely better. I think I might still hike it up just a little bit. It's still softening all this, but I think I want to maintain this differentiation between those shapes. So again, sculpting with light in this render, okay? And then, the last thing I wanted to say is, it's I was talking to Elia actually about this model at first, and I asked her to provide me with the model itself, and she wanted to send me all the textures for it. And actually, I think it's so much preferable and important, especially when you get going, to try to light these scenes without any textures, fancy materials, or anything like this. This is just what you might call a clay render, right? The only thing I did is I did add a separate material for the corneas in here, so we get this little highlight on the eyes, because that's important. I want to see where that shows up. But the rest of this is just to understand the form, the sculpture of it, right? So we're sculpting with light, and we don't want to get confused with When you get into materials, you might set the diffuse or the reflective too high or too low, and then as you're adjusting your lighting, you're doing that based on an inaccurate setting in your material. So if you get your lighting set with just this gray here, and you start putting materials on, and it doesn't look right, it's probably because of your material settings, not your lighting settings, right? So I would always advise doing a lighting setup as a clay render, right? So this is a lighting study to make sure that's working. And then afterwards, we'd come back and figure out what to do with the materials. Okay, so that's a lot of talking for this one. I hate to do it that way, but I think it's important to talk about those concepts and kind of set things up, right? I don't know why my little render man thing wants to go away there. So anyways, I'm going to pause this, and in part 2, we'll come back to a scene with no lights, and we'll start adding that to the scene. We'll put some material on it, and you'll get a sense of how to start some renders using RenderMan.